Welcome to another deep dive. This time, you've thrown us a real head-scratcher. Consciousness. We've got Anil Seth's book, Being You, a new science of consciousness to guide us. And I gotta say, just from the intro, it's already been quite the wild ride.
It's a fascinating read, isn't it? Seth's approach is really refreshing. He dives deep into the biology and neuroscience behind consciousness, which I think helps make it feel less like this abstract mystery and more like something we can actually grasp.
I totally agree. I mean, we all know what it feels like to be conscious, but actually explaining how it works, how this lunk of gray matter in our skulls gives rise to the feeling of being. Well, us. That's a whole other challenge. And Seth doesn't shy away from that challenge. He jumps right in with a story about his own experience with anesthesia.
Such a powerful way to start the book, right? It really highlights the fundamental puzzle of consciousness. 1 minute you're aware, experiencing the world, and the next, poof, lights out, it's gone. And it all comes down to changes in the physical brain. It makes you wonder, how can something material, like neurons firing, create something as immaterial as subjective experience?
Right. And this leads to one of Seth's core arguments. Consciousness isn't just about intelligence, it's about being alive. He challenges that old beast machine idea, which basically claimed that animals lack consciousness because they don't have our level of rational thought.
And what's even more interesting is that Seth goes even further with this idea. He suggests that even simple organisms, the ones we might consider pretty basic, have a basic form of consciousness. Maybe not composing symphonies or writing poetry, but their brains are still constantly predicting and controlling their internal states to stay alive.
So even a single-celled amoeba might have a tiny flicker of awareness. That's mind-blowing. But if consciousness is linked to life itself, how do we explain the vast differences in experience, say, between that amoeba and a human being who can write a novel or design a skyscraper?
That's where we run straight into the infamous hard problem of consciousness. How do these physical processes, neurons firing, chemicals interacting, create the subjective experience of being you? It's a question that has baffled philosophers and scientists for centuries.
And of course, there are tons of different theories out there trying to tackle this hard problem. Just skimming through the book, I felt like I was drowning in isms. Physicalism, idealism, panpsychism. It's a lot to take in.
It can definitely feel overwhelming at times. But these isms are essentially different ways of thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. They're all trying to figure out how something physical, like the brain, can give rise to something intangible and subjective, like experience.
So where does Seth himself land in all of this? Does he have a favorite ism?
Seth leans towards physicalism, which is the idea that consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain. He finds other positions, like panpsychism, which proposes that consciousness is fundamental to the universe and exists in everything, less helpful because they don't offer testable predictions.
So if consciousness is rooted in the physical brain, does that mean we can actually measure it objectively? Can we put a number on consciousness?
And this is where things get really exciting. Scientists are developing tools to do just that. Quantify consciousness. One example is something called the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI for short.
PCI, okay, I'm all ears. What is that?
Well, PCI measures how the brain responds to a magnetic pulse. The more complex the brain's response, the higher the level of consciousness is thought to be.
Hold on, you're saying scientists can zap your brain with a magnet and tell you how conscious you are. That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
I know, right? But it's actually becoming a reality. There's another technique called zipping brain activity, which looks at the algorithmic complexity of brain signals. This can also be used as a kind of proxy for the level of consciousness.
Mind-blowing. So are we going to see consciousness checks at the doctor's office in the future, right next to blood pressure and temperature?
Maybe not quite yet, but it's a fascinating possibility. And it leads to another key distinction that Seth makes in the book. Conscious level versus conscious content.
Conscious level versus conscious content. Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
Conscious level is about how conscious you are, kind of like a dimmer switch, while conscious content is about what you're conscious of.
I think I need an example. Can you give me a real-world scenario where these two are different?
Sure. Think about dreaming. When you're dreaming, you're having all these vivid experiences, right? Images, emotions, narratives. So the content of your consciousness is high. But your conscious level is actually lower because you're asleep.
Oh, I see what you mean. So someone in a coma might be having incredibly vivid dreams, but we would never know because their level of consciousness is so low that they can't respond or communicate with us.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting. Seth talks about how psychedelics might actually increase conscious level, at least according to some of these measures.
Really? That's counterintuitive. We usually think of being on psychedelics as being out of it, not more conscious.
I know, it seems strange. But it might be more about a shift in the type of consciousness rather than a decrease. Psychedelics can scramble brain activity, making it more diverse and unpredictable, which seems to correlate with higher scores on things like the PCI.
So it challenges this assumption that conscious level and content are always linked. It's like psychedelics might be turning up the dimmer switch on consciousness, but also changing the channel, so to speak.
Precisely, and that just opens up a whole new can of worms about how we define and measure different states of consciousness. It's a fascinating area of research.
It really is amazing how much we still don't know about this thing we call consciousness. And speaking of things that are hard to grasp, Seth also delves into this really intriguing theory called integrated information theory, or IIT for short. Have you heard of this one?
Oh, absolutely. IIT is one of the most talked about theories in the field right now. It's trying to provide a fundamental answer to the question, what is consciousness? Its core idea is that consciousness is integrated information.
Okay, that sounds pretty abstract. I'm going to need a bit more explanation on that one. How do they even define integrated information?
Well, they use this really clever analogy to help explain it. Temperature. Think about how we measure temperature. It's essentially a measure of how much the molecules in a substance are moving around, how much energy they have. IIT suggests that consciousness is similar, but instead of measuring molecular motion, we're measuring the amount of integrated information within a system.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. But how do you actually measure this integrated information? It still seems pretty intangible to me.
Right, it's not something we can just stick a thermometer into. But the basic idea is that you look at how much information a system generates as a whole compared to the information generated by its individual parts. The more interconnected and interdependent the parts of the system are, the higher the level of integrated information. They represent this measure of integrated information with the Greek letter phi, I.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, a system like the human brain, with billions of neurons all interconnected and firing in complex patterns, would have a very high level of phi and therefore a high level of consciousness.
Exactly. That's the basic premise of IIT. However, there's a big catch.
Oh, what's the catch?
Well, the catch is that actually calculating phi for any real-world system, especially something as complex as the brain, is incredibly difficult. In fact, some argue that it might be impossible with our current technology and understanding.
So it's a theory that's really hard to test directly. That seems like a pretty big hurdle.
It definitely makes it challenging to validate experimentally. However, even if IIT ultimately proves difficult to test or fully confirm, it has still stimulated a lot of new research and generated a lot of debate in the field, which is valuable in itself. It's pushing the boundaries of our thinking about consciousness.
I could see that. It's definitely a thought-provoking theory. So, moving on from IIT, Seth also dedicates a good chunk of the book to the topic of perception. One of his key points is that our perceptions aren't just passive reflections of the world, but actually active constructions, models that our brains create.
That's right. And this is where he introduces this fascinating concept of controlled hallucination. Our brains aren't just sitting back and passively receiving information from the senses. They're actively generating predictions about what's out there in the world based on our past experiences and the incoming sensory data.
So it's like our brains are constantly creating their own best guess about reality based on what they already know and what our senses are telling us in the moment.
Precisely. Our perceptions are essentially our brain's best guess. Its interpretation of the sensory data it's receiving. And what's really interesting is that these best guesses can sometimes vary quite a bit from person to person.
Okay, now I need an example. How can our perceptions be so different if we're all looking at the same thing?
Well, a perfect example of this is the infamous the dress phenomenon that went viral a few years back. Do you remember that one? That picture of the dress that some people saw as blue and black, while others saw it as white and gold.
Oh, yes, I remember that. It was all over the internet. Everyone was arguing about what color it really was. I think I saw it as white and gold, if I remember correctly.
Interesting. Well, that's exactly the point. Different brains with their unique wiring and different sets of past experiences can arrive at very different best guesses about the lighting, the shadows, and the colors in that image, leading to those stark differences in perception.
So even something as seemingly basic and objective as color perception is subjective, depending on how our individual brains interpret the information. That's wild.
It really highlights how active a role our brains play in shaping our experience of reality. And this leads us to another crucial concept that Seth explores: prediction error minimization.
Prediction error minimization. Okay, I have no idea what that means. You're going to have to break that down for me.
Sure, it's actually a pretty simple idea once you get the hang of it. Basically, our brains are constantly comparing their predictions about the world to the actual sensory data they're receiving. And when there's a mismatch, when something happens that we didn't predict, our brains experience a prediction error.
So like when you reach for your coffee cup and it's not there because someone moved it, that feeling of surprise and confusion would be a prediction error.
Exactly. That's a great example. And while those prediction errors might feel jarring in the moment, they're actually incredibly important because they tell our brains that their model of the world needs updating. They help us learn and adapt.
Oh, I see. So every time we're surprised by something, our brains are essentially getting a little wake-up call saying, hey, your model needs some tweaking.
That's a great way to put it. It's a constant process of refinement and adaptation. Our brains are always working to minimize those prediction errors and create a more accurate representation of reality.
This is all so fascinating. But it makes me wonder if our perceptions of the world are these constructed models, these controlled hallucinations, what about our sense of self? Is that a construction too? Is the me that I experience just another one of my brain's best guesses?
That's a great question, and it takes us to one of Seth's most thought-provoking ideas. He argues that, just like our perception of the world, our sense of self is not a fixed, unchanging entity, but rather an ongoing construction, a kind of best guess that our brains are constantly updating.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying that the me that I feel like, this continuous, stable self, is actually an illusion, just a product of my brain's activity?
It might sound strange at first, but there's actually a lot of evidence to support this idea. There are some really cool illusions that demonstrate this, like the famous rubber hand illusion.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one. That's where they make you feel like a rubber hand is your own hand, right?
Exactly. By cleverly manipulating sensory input, researchers can trick your brain into incorporating a fake hand into your sense of self. Even though you consciously know it's not your real hand, it's a powerful demonstration of how malleable our sense of self can be.
It's a bit creepy, but also really amazing. So our brains are always working behind the scenes to create this feeling of a unified self. But it's not nearly as fixed and solid as we tend to think.
Right. And there are even more extreme examples like out-of-body experiences, which can actually be induced in the lab using virtual reality technology.
Really? So they can make people feel like they're floating outside of their bodies.
It sounds crazy, but yes. And it shows that even our most basic sense of embodiment, the feeling of being located inside our own bodies, can be disrupted when our brains receive conflicting sensory information. It challenges our assumptions about the very nature of selfhood.
Wow. This is definitely making me rethink everything I thought I knew about myself. So we've covered perception, we've talked about the self. Where do emotions fit into all of this? How do emotions work in this framework of the brain as a prediction machine?
That's a great question, and it's something that Seth explores in detail. He argues that emotions are not just reactions to the world, they are active predictions about our own internal bodily states. They're part of this constant loop of prediction, sensory feedback, and error correction that our brains are engaged in.
So instead of emotions being triggered by external events, you're saying that they're actually our brains predicting how those events will affect our bodies, like anticipating how we're going to feel.
Precisely. It's about anticipating those bodily changes and preparing for action. For example, think about the feeling of anxiety. It's not just an abstract feeling in your head, it's your brain predicting a potential threat, a future state of distress, and triggering all those familiar physiological changes in your body. Increased heart rate, sweating, muscle tension, that feeling of unease in your gut.
Oh, wow, I never thought about it that way. So our emotions are really deeply embodied. They're not just mental states. They're tied to our physical being in a very real way.
Exactly. And this actually connects back to that beast machine concept that we talked about earlier. Seth argues that emotions are crucial for survival because they help us anticipate and respond to threats and opportunities in our environment. They prepare us to take action, whether it's fight, flight, or something else entirely.
This is all so incredibly mind-expanding. It's really changing the way I think about how my mind works, how all the pieces fit together. It's like we're peeling back the layers of consciousness and seeing this amazing interplay between brain, body, and the world around us.
I love that analogy. And it leads us to some even bigger, even more mind-boggling questions like, could machines ever be conscious? Could we create artificial consciousness?
Yes. The age-old question of AI and consciousness. With artificial intelligence advancing so rapidly, it feels like we're getting closer and closer to that possibility, but also maybe further away in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's such a complex issue. And Seth doesn't shy away from these questions either. He argues that just because a machine can achieve human-level intelligence, even surpass human intelligence in certain areas, doesn't necessarily mean that it's conscious. A machine might be able to pass the Turing test, meaning it can carry on a conversation so convincingly that you can't tell it's not human, but that doesn't prove that it has subjective experience.
So how would we even know if a machine was truly conscious? What kind of test could we use to determine that?
That's the million-dollar question. Seth proposes something called the Garland test as a potential way to assess machine consciousness. It goes beyond just language and behavior, looking for signs of that flexible, adaptive intelligence that we associate with consciousness in humans.
So not just a machine that can solve complex problems or play chess at a grandmaster level, but a machine that can learn, adapt, be creative, come up with novel solutions, even surprise us with its insights.
Exactly. That kind of genuine understanding, the ability to come up with truly new ideas, might suggest the presence of something like consciousness. It wouldn't be proof, of course, but it would be a very interesting sign.
This all raises so many ethical and philosophical questions. If we do manage to create conscious machines, how would we treat them? Would they have rights? Would they be considered persons under the law?
Those are all crucial questions that we as a society need to start grappling with now, before it's too late. It's not just about the philosophical implications, but the very practical, real-world consequences of interacting with potentially conscious beings that we ourselves have created.
It's a future that's both exciting and a bit terrifying to think about, to be honest. It feels like we're standing at the edge of something truly profound, but we don't know exactly what's on the other side.
I agree. It's both exhilarating and a bit daunting. But as Seth points out, the more we understand about the nature of consciousness, both in ourselves and potentially in other forms of intelligence, the better prepared we'll be to navigate this uncharted territory and make wise decisions about our future.
And that understanding starts with being willing to question our assumptions, to realize that even our most fundamental experiences, our perceptions, our sense of self, our emotions, are not necessarily what they seem.
Exactly. It's about embracing the mystery of consciousness while also pursuing a scientific understanding of its inner workings. It's a journey of exploration, both inward and outward. And speaking of outward, Seth also touches on the fascinating question of animal consciousness. I mean, we humans have a tendency to assume that we're the only conscious beings on the planet. But is that really true?
Yeah, it's a very human-centric way of looking at things, isn't it?
Yeah.
We assume that our way of experiencing the world is the only way, or at least the most important way. But Seth challenges that anthropocentric bias pretty directly. He says we shouldn't judge an animal's consciousness based solely on its intelligence or its ability to communicate with us in ways that we understand.
Right. Just because a dog can't, write a symphony or solve complex equations doesn't mean that it's not experiencing the world in a rich and meaningful way. I mean, think about how much emotion a dog can express, how much joy they can feel just from playing fetch or going for a walk.
I know, it's so true. They might not be pondering the meaning of life, but they're definitely experiencing it to the fullest. Seth even suggests that consciousness might be far more widespread in the animal kingdom than we traditionally thought.
He uses the example of cephalopods, which are creatures like octopuses and squids. They have incredibly complex nervous systems and display some really remarkable intelligence.
Octopuses are amazing. I saw this documentary once about how they can solve puzzles, use tools, and even escape from seemingly impossible situations. It's incredible.
It really is. Can you imagine what it would be like to experience the world through 8 independently thinking arms? To have that kind of decentralized intelligence and awareness.
Oh, it's mind-blowing. And the way they can change color and texture to blend in with their surroundings, it's almost like their consciousness is externalized right there on their skin for everyone to see.
It's a powerful reminder that there are so many different ways of being in the world, so many different forms of intelligence and awareness that we might not even recognize as such because they're so different from our own.
Absolutely, and it really underscores Seth's point that consciousness is fundamentally tied to being alive, to navigating the world, and to interacting with the environment in all its complexity.
It reminds us that we're all part of this incredible web of life and that our consciousness in all its human-specific glory is just one expression of this much larger phenomenon.
So after this deep dive into Seth's book, I have to say I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, also incredibly inspired. My brain is definitely full. I'm wondering, where do we go from here? What are the next frontiers in the study of consciousness? What are the big questions that researchers are trying to answer?
That's the beauty of science. Every answer just leads to more questions, but I think one of the most exciting areas of research right now is in developing new tools and technologies to measure and even manipulate consciousness directly. We talked about things like the PCI and zipping brain activity earlier, but there are even more cutting-edge techniques emerging, like optogenetics. Have you heard of that?
Optogenetics. Vaguely. It sounds very sci-fi.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a real thing. Optogenetics allows researchers to use light to control specific neurons in the brain. They can target individual brain cells and essentially turn them on or off using pulses of light.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So you're saying that one day we might be able to literally turn consciousness on and off like a light switch?
Well, it's not quite that simple, of course, but the possibilities are pretty mind-boggling. Being able to precisely control brain activity at that level could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness. It could also lead to incredible new treatments for people with disorders of consciousness, like those in a coma or those with locked-in syndrome.
It's an incredible thought. To be able to help someone regain consciousness, to free them from that kind of mental prison, would be a truly amazing thing.
It would be a game changer for sure. And it highlights how important this research is. It's not just about solving a philosophical puzzle. It's about understanding the very essence of what makes us human and using that knowledge to improve lives and alleviate suffering.
It's about cracking the code of consciousness, figuring out what it is, how it works, and what it means for us as individuals and as a species.
Exactly. And as we continue to explore this inner universe, this amazing world inside our own heads, who knows what incredible discoveries await us.
Well, I think my brain needs a break after all of that. Time to go for a walk and let all those new ideas sink in.
Sounds like a great plan. Get out there, enjoy the fresh air, and maybe have a few more prediction errors along the way.
I'll be sure to keep my eyes peeled for surprises. Until next time, keep diving deep into the fascinating world of consciousness. And for our listeners who want a quick recap of all the mind-bending ideas we've explored today, here are 10 key takeaways from our deep dive into Anil Seth's Being You.
Number 1, consciousness is more about being alive than being intelligent. Even simple organisms might have a basic form of awareness. Number 2, the hard problem of consciousness asks how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience.
Number 3, scientists are developing incredible tools to measure consciousness, like zipping brain activity and the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI. Number 4, psychedelics might actually increase conscious level, which challenges our conventional thinking about these altered states of awareness.
Number 5, integrated information theory, or IIT, proposes that consciousness is integrated information, but calculating this for complex systems remains a major challenge.
Number 6, our perceptions are controlled hallucinations. Our brain's best guesses about the world, shaped by our past experiences and expectations. Number 7, our brains are constantly refining their models of reality through prediction error minimization, updating those predictions whenever we encounter something surprising or unexpected.
Number 8, even our sense of self is a controlled hallucination, a construction of the brain rather than a fixed, unchanging entity. Number 9, emotions are not just feelings, they are embodied predictions about our internal state, and they play a crucial role in our survival.
And finally, number 10, the possibility of creating conscious machines raises profound ethical and philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of personhood, and our responsibilities to these potentially sentient beings.
Wow, that was a lot to cover.
It was a wild ride. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the mysteries of the mind. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.